Well, is Poland about to walk away from Ukraine? Some major developments over the past 48 hours, and just in the past few hours, actually, in NATO's war in Ukraine. First, Poland's prime minister said last night that, quote, "We are no longer transferring weapons to Ukraine because we are now arming Poland with more modern weapons." That's pretty stunning. And then President Duda of Poland compared Ukraine to a drowning person and said it's best to stay away from a drowning person because they are extremely dangerous. Listen to his remarks.
Mamy trochę do czynienia tak z tonącym. My jesteśmy tym, który ratuje. Jak jest tonący, każdy, kto kiedykolwiek brał udział w ratowaniu tonącego, czy każdy, kto kiedykolwiek uczył się o tym, co dzieje się w tej sytuacji, wie o tym, że człowiek tonący jest niesłychanie niebezpieczny, ponieważ może pociągnąć w głębiny. Ma siłę niewyobrażalną na skutek obawy osobistej, wpływu adrenaliny i może po prostu utopić ratującego. Chwyta się wszystkiego, mówi się przecież w przysłowiu, tonący brzytwy się chwyta. Rzeczywiście tonący chwyta się wszystkiego, czego się da. Trochę to jest taka sytuacja jak dzisiaj między Polską a Ukrainą. Czy trzeba działać tak, żeby się obronić przed uczynieniem nam szkody przez tonącego? Oczywiście, że musimy tak działać, żeby się obronić przed uczynieniem nam szkody przez tonącego, bo jak tonący doprowadzi do szkody i nas utopi, to nie dostanie pomocy. W związku z powyższym to my musimy pilnować tutaj swoich interesów. To jest przede wszystkim nasz obowiązek i będziemy to robili skutecznie i zdecydowanie.
Well, he's absolutely right about that. As a lifeguard myself, there's nothing more dangerous than a drowning person who wants to pull you under. Mike Krupa is a Polish journalist and historian, host of Votum TV. He joins us from Warsaw, Poland. Mike, good to see you. So Ukraine is a drowning person? How's this resonating in Poland today?
Hello, Clayton. Welcome. Great to be back on the show. Well, I think it's in line with Polish public opinion because the trends, and this was reported, I think, by Reuters or the Associated Press yesterday, that the attitude towards Ukrainian refugees in Poland has basically dropped since February 2022 from 90%, that's the figures that they presented, to about 62%. I've seen other figures. Generally, there's a trend in the other direction. Poles are fed up with the influx of refugees, real or imagined, into Poland, and Poles definitely do not want to become another proxy in Washington's war with Russia. So these trends are there. The question is whether the government is only using this as a ploy to get elected once again on October 15th, as we have our parliamentary elections, or are they taking this seriously because they're seeing the trends, the obvious trends that are currently taking place in the United States, whereby Washington is slowly but surely beginning to distance itself from Zelensky and from the war in Ukraine.
There's been some interesting speculation on the part of some polls that I've seen that Duda is distancing himself from Zelensky, in part laying the groundwork for a recapturing of historically Polish territory in Western Ukraine. I'm a pretty cynical person, but I mean, that seems like a pretty big leap there, is it not? But if you're arming yourself, we're going to keep all of the modern weapons for ourselves, and we're starting to distance ourselves from Ukraine. Could one make that assessment?
Well, I think if you look at the words of Prime Minister Morawiecki, because I think that's what everybody's been commenting on in the last 24 hours, that he said, we are no longer arming Ukraine. Well, the spokesperson for the government came out this morning. He was on a Polish radio show, and he stated that in order to clarify what Morawiecki said, because apparently it was taken out of context. In essence, what he says is, right now, we are no longer sending any new equipment to Ukraine. We are only fulfilling contracts that we already had signed with Ukraine. Whereas up until a few weeks ago, we were sending, equipment and military aid of the value of about 3 billion euros. That's the calculation as it stands today, that we were not really contracting for. We're just basically giving it to the Ukrainians. So from what I understand, what happens right now is we are no longer going to be giving this, aid for free to Ukraine. We are only going to be fulfilling contracts. But on the contracts that were obviously previously signed. But on the other hand, it's important to note that we have given you, and one can be cynical about this, obviously, as you noted, that we have given Ukraine all our equipment, therefore we don't have anything to give. So,
Right.
as I noted today in my, sort of one-sided exchange with the Polish ambassador in Washington, D.C., Marek Magierowski on Twitter, he said that, we basically depleted our military stockpiles because we gave them to Ukraine, and now we have to rearm. So I wrote to him, okay, so you depleted the stockpiles, you have to rearm, you're going to buy new equipment in order to give it to Ukraine. Brilliant. That makes perfect sense. So they have a very comfortable situation right now, because up until October 15th, the government can play, this ultra-nationalist, anti-Ukrainian hero, which obviously they're not, because the entire grain deal, which, by the way, was supported originally by the current government's members of the European Parliament back in May 2022, they voted for this liberalization, only to be, acting as the victim a year later. So I see a lot of disingenuity on the part of the current government. Let's not forget also that this morning, a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, in reference to what Morawiecki said yesterday about stopping the flow of weapons to Ukraine, said, no, we haven't noticed any stopping of the weapons coming to Ukraine. That's still coming. So either Morawiecki is lying or the Ukrainian member of parliament is lying. So we'll have to see where that goes.
What about this drowning man comment? The idea that Ukraine is a drowning man and very, very dangerous. What exactly does Duda mean by that?
I think on its own, the description is very apt, because if you recall, Zelensky gave an interview a few weeks back, or a few days ago, I think it was to The Economist, where he said that basically he implied that if the collective West were to move away from supporting Ukraine to the levels that it was supporting it thus far, all the Ukrainians that are in the West, the Ukrainian refugees, might be pushed into a corner and ... He didn't elaborate what he meant by that, but, pushed into a corner, you can consider that, I don't know, maybe terrorism, for example, using those, some of that 15 million guns that are flying around Ukraine by the civilians in Western Europe. I mean, who knows, right? So I think what President Duda meant, and I'm trying to put as positive a spin on this as I can, is that Zelensky is basically becoming more unhinged and becoming more dangerous. But the interesting thing about those comments that Duda made to the Polish journalist in New York was his entire speech given at the UN was very, it was neoconish boilerplate. There was no word of criticism there basically for Ukraine. It was only after, when he met with the journalist, that he actually came out against Ukraine. Because, as I said, the speech itself was, Russia bad, Putin is an imperialist, Ukraine will defeat Putin, we need to help Ukraine. That was it. I looked at the speech this morning, was actually surprised that it wasn't in line with the current situation vis-a-vis Warsaw and Kiev.
So I guess in that room at the United Nations, it's hard to look in the face of Zelensky and make those comments about a dangerous drowning man. It's only after you walk out of that building, you're away from those ugly green tiles on the backdrop of the United Nations building, that you go outside and speak to the press, and where perhaps you tell the truth. And telling the truth about this grain deal. Can you educate our audience as to the nuances of this grain deal and why this has been such a lightning rod?
Well, the entire grain deal basically comes down to the fact that because of the war, Ukraine says it's blockaded by the Russians. They're not able to export their grain via the traditional routes through the Black Sea. So what they need is an opening in the West, i.e. the European Union. The nearest country to the Ukraine is obviously the biggest country. The biggest market is Poland. So they want to send their grain through Poland into the other markets, or into Poland itself. Now, obviously, that creates a huge competition for our farmers. There's going to be a lot of price dumping, and it's something that's unexpected. It basically debalances the market. And let's not forget, as Prime Minister Viktor Orban actually pointed out, that a lot of this grain in Ukraine is actually grown via sort of American standards. So it's actually pretty crappy grain, and a lot of it doesn't go through the rigorous controls like they usually do in the European Union. So they're dumping a lot of poison into the market. They're not only creating an imbalance in the price ratio, they're getting a lot of Polish farmers angry. Not only Polish farmers, because it's the Czechs, the Hungarians. They basically have the same policy. I think the Romanians also. They want to keep their markets closed to this entire dump of Ukrainian grain coming in. So it's a sound policy. The question is, why were all these countries, with the exception of Hungary, because I don't think Orban's MEPs were voting on it in the European Parliament, but every single member of the Law and Justice Party, which is the party that is ruling in Poland, last year voted to liberalize the exact thing that we're talking about right now. So the import of Ukrainian grain into the European Union. And now they're complaining they're the victim. So to me, it's very disingenuous. And I think there's a lot of evidence to show that they're only doing this up until the elections, and then come October 15th, if Law and Justice wins the elections, I would not be surprised if it's going to be business as usual, and they'll find some sort of formula for opening up the market because, you know, Putin, because the war, because we have to help Ukraine. So
Right.
I think that's where we're going to be going.
And that crappy Monsanto grain that's basically being grown on, I don't know, BlackRock Vanguard soil now in Ukraine, which of course, you know, Ukraine is being bought up and controlled by a lot of these massive corporations now, the West owns. So they can turn that fertile land into these green pastures and so forth. So unbelievable. Any final thoughts? Any sort of major pieces that we missed on this today, Mike, that you think are important for our audience to know about this? Because it seems like there's a big movement now in Europe, and I think these comments were calculated. I mean, again, you don't just make this mistake and then have to clarify it later. You're really, I think, putting up a trial balloon here to really show that you're moving away from Ukraine.
I think there might be two reasons for this. Well, first of all, obviously the elections are coming up, so we have to play the tough guy. On the other hand, if you consider that when Zelensky came to New York for his big United Nations speech, which he apparently himself attended in the audience, if you watch the Ukrainian view of the situation, Telegram viewers know what I'm talking about. But what happened was, on the same day, the New York Times reported that missile that hit Konstantinivka wasn't a Russian missile at all. It was a Ukrainian missile. So that was a nice welcome to the UN from the New York Times, the newspaper of record to Zelensky. But you can see the trends are changing, right? So if you consider that every major foreign policy decision made by every Polish government after 1989 sort of went parallel to what Washington was deciding on the big geopolitical scene. What I'm guessing is, other than the elections, another factor that might be playing into these comments is that, okay, the trends in Washington are changing. They're becoming more hardline towards Zelensky. They might be thinking of dumping him. So we should take an appropriate line as well and distance ourselves from him. That very well may be the case. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was, which obviously, you know, testifies to the fact that we don't have a sovereign foreign policy in Poland. We just listen to the trends on the Potomac, or we listen to instructions coming from Washington. But another interesting thing that I think I should point out before I go is next week, or in 2 weeks, there will be parliamentary elections in Slovakia. And the man who's slated to win those elections is Roberto Fico, or Fico, as we say in Eastern Europe. And he used to be Prime Minister of Slovakia. And Fico has said that if he comes to power, all aid to Ukraine is coming to an end, and he will take a different stance towards the Ukrainian conflict than Washington dictates. Those are his words. So I think, should he win the elections in Slovakia, that'll send a trend, I think, and a signal to Polish voters to think, well, you know, if Slovakia has taken a different course, why can't we? So I think it's something to look out for before October 15th, what happens in the parliamentary elections in Bratislava.
That's a great point. And you're seeing United States members of Congress now saying we will not vote for an extension of the debt ceiling, funding the United States government. If there is any funding in there for Ukraine, we are done funding the war in Ukraine. And Senator Rand Paul is steadfast in this. We'll see if he caves.
I hope they hold the line on this. I'm watching Matt Gaetz, I'm watching J.D. Vance, I'm watching all the firebrands and diehards in Congress, and I hope they hold the line, because this time you can't let go. You really have to hold the line on this.
From your mouth to God's ears.